The most painful insult I ever heard was not shouted in anger. It was spoken casually over dinner by someone who thought I no longer mattered. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and fresh dinner rolls. The table was set beautifully, just as it was every Sunday evening. At 72 years old, I still looked forward to family dinners. They had become one of the few traditions that remained after my husband Harold passed away 3 years earlier. I arrived carrying a homemade peach cobbler, Daniel's favorite dessert since he was a little boy. I had spent nearly 2 hours preparing it that afternoon. Old habits are hard to break. Mothers continue caring for their children long after those children stop needing it. Nicole barely glanced at the dish when I placed it on the counter. "Just put it over there," she said while scrolling through her phone. I smiled anyway. I had learned not to take small things personally. The evening began normally enough. Daniel talked about work. Nicole discussed a neighborhood event she planned to attend. I listened more than I spoke. That had become my role lately. The listener, the observer, the extra chair at the table. Several times I tried joining the conversation, but each attempt seemed to fade away before anyone really acknowledged it. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. Families get busy. Life moves quickly. People become distracted. Then it happened. I reached for a glass of iced tea and accidentally bumped it with my hand. The glass tipped over. Tea spread across the tablecloth and dripped onto the floor. "Oh goodness," I said quickly, grabbing a napkin. "I am so sorry." For a moment, nobody spoke. I expected a simple response. Maybe a laugh. Maybe someone saying it was no big deal. Instead, Nicole let out a long sigh and leaned back in her chair. "This is exactly what I mean," she said. I looked up. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms. "You are becoming a burden, Evelyn." The room became completely silent. I can still remember the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the ticking clock on the wall, the distant barking of a dog somewhere outside. Everything seemed strangely clear. I turned toward Daniel. Surely he would say something. Surely he would tell his wife she had gone too far. He looked down at his plate. That was all. No objection. No defense. No discomfort. Just silence. Somehow that hurt more than Nicole's words. Because insults from strangers do not stay with you. Silence from your own child does. Nicole shook her head and stood to grab paper towels. "I am just being honest," she said. "Someone has to be." I watched her clean the table. I watched Daniel continue eating. I looked around the dining room, where family photographs covered the walls. There were pictures from birthdays, graduations, vacations, and holidays. Decades of memories surrounded me. Yet in that moment, I had never felt more alone. I stood slowly and folded my napkin. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly. Daniel finally looked up. "Mom," he began, but whatever he planned to say arrived too late. I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me. The night air felt cool against my face as I stepped outside. I sat in my car for several minutes before turning the key. Through the dining room window, I could see them continuing their meal. Talking, eating, living as though nothing important had happened. As though a single sentence had not changed everything. Driving home, I realized I could forgive many things. Mistakes, misunderstandings, thoughtless comments spoken in frustration. But one question refused to leave my mind. If Nicole believed I was a burden, how long had Daniel believed it too? The drive home felt longer than usual. Streetlights passed one after another outside my windshield, casting brief flashes of light across the dashboard. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. Not because I was angry. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was something quieter, something heavier. By the time I reached my house, the peach cobbler was still sitting untouched in the back seat. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. The house greeted me with silence. 3 years earlier, that silence had felt peaceful. Harold used to spend evenings reading in his favorite chair while I worked crossword puzzles at the kitchen table. Even when neither of us spoke, the house felt full. After he passed away, the quiet became different. Larger somehow. More noticeable. That night it felt almost overwhelming. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The clock above the stove showed 9:43. I stared at the steam rising from the mug and replayed the evening in my mind. Not Nicole's words. I already knew exactly what she had said. What I could not stop thinking about was Daniel's reaction. Or rather, his lack of one. I remembered the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. The teenager who called whenever he needed advice. The young man who promised me that family would always come first. Somewhere between those memories and the man sitting at that dinner table, something had changed. The next morning, I followed my normal routine. I watered the flowers in the backyard. I read the newspaper with breakfast. I drove to the grocery store. On the surface, everything appeared ordinary. Yet I found myself noticing things I had ignored before. During the past year, Daniel called less often unless he needed information. Nicole rarely invited me to family outings anymore. Holiday plans were usually announced after decisions had already been made. Small things. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern I had never fully examined. That afternoon, I opened an old photo album. Harold smiled from nearly every page. Camping trips, anniversaries, birthday parties. There was one photograph of Daniel at age 10 holding a fishing pole beside his father. Both of them looked impossibly happy. I traced the edge of the picture with my finger. Harold had always been observant. He noticed things other people missed. Suddenly, I found myself wondering whether he had seen changes in Daniel before I did. Later that evening, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For several seconds, I simply looked at it. Then I answered. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded cautious. "Hello, Daniel." There was a brief silence. "About last night," he began. I waited. Nicole was frustrated. She did not mean it the way it sounded. I closed my eyes. Not an apology. Not a defense. An explanation. "I see," I said. "She has been under a lot of stress lately." Again, an explanation. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, I sat quietly staring at the phone in my hand. Something important had become clear. Daniel was not calling because he believed I deserved an apology. He was calling because he wanted the discomfort to disappear. There is a difference. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether that dinner had not revealed a sudden problem at all. Perhaps it had simply exposed one that had been growing for years while I refused to see it. Over the next several days, I stopped trying to convince myself that everything was normal. That was new for me. For years, whenever something felt uncomfortable, I searched for an innocent explanation. If a phone call was not returned, people were busy. If I was left out of plans, it was an oversight. If conversations became awkward when I entered a room, I assumed I was imagining things. But after that dinner, the excuses became harder to find. On Wednesday afternoon, I stopped by Daniel's house to drop off a box of old family photographs I thought he might want. I had called ahead and left a message. Nobody answered, but that was not unusual. When I arrived, Nicole's car was in the driveway. So was Daniel's truck. I rang the doorbell. No answer. As I turned to leave, I heard voices through an open kitchen window. Not enough to understand every word. Just enough to recognize Daniel and Nicole. Then I heard my name. I froze. "She does not need all that space anymore," Nicole said. "It is ridiculous." There was a pause. Then Daniel replied, "I know. Just give it time." My stomach tightened. I stood there for another moment before quietly walking back to my car. Neither of them knew I had been outside. The entire drive home, I replayed those 2 sentences in my mind. They could have been talking about anything. My house, my belongings, my life. The uncertainty bothered me more than certainty would have. 2 days later, another small thing happened. I visited the bank to deposit a check. The branch manager, a pleasant woman named Carol, greeted me warmly. During our conversation, she casually mentioned receiving an inquiry several weeks earlier about procedures for adding authorized family members to certain financial accounts. "Just general information," she explained. Nothing was changed. I smiled politely and thanked her. But my thoughts immediately drifted toward Daniel and Nicole. Neither had mentioned asking questions about my finances. That evening, I opened a drawer in my home office and began sorting through old paperwork. Most of it was ordinary. Tax documents, insurance policies, property records. Then I noticed something strange. A folder I distinctly remembered placing there months earlier was missing. I searched every shelf, every cabinet, every desk drawer. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I had misplaced it. Yet the feeling remained. Small incidents were beginning to connect like pieces of a puzzle. None of them proved anything on their own. Together, they created an uncomfortable picture. The following Sunday, Daniel called unexpectedly. His tone was unusually cheerful. "Nicole and I were thinking maybe we could all have dinner again next week," he said. "Start fresh." I stared out my living room window at the backyard garden Harold had planted years ago. The roses were beginning to bloom. "That sounds nice," I replied. "Good," Daniel said quickly. There are also a few things we wanted to discuss. Nothing major. Nothing major. Another phrase that lingered after the conversation ended. I set the phone down and looked around the quiet room. For the first time, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. Deep down, I already knew the answer. The real question was how much Daniel and Nicole were hiding from me. And for some reason, I had the feeling that the answer was much larger than either of them realized. The dinner invitation arrived exactly as Daniel promised. Wednesday evening, 6 o'clock. Nicole even sent a cheerful text saying she was looking forward to seeing me. The friendliness felt strange after everything that had happened, but I accepted. Part of me wanted answers. Another part wanted to see what would happen if I simply listened. When I arrived, the atmosphere seemed unusually pleasant. Nicole greeted me with a smile. Daniel offered to take my coat. Dinner was already waiting on the table. If someone had walked into the room without knowing the recent history, they would have assumed we were a perfectly happy family. Throughout the meal, Nicole was attentive. Daniel was relaxed. The conversation flowed easily, yet something felt rehearsed. Like actors following a script they had practiced beforehand. About halfway through dinner, Daniel brought up my house. "Mom, have you ever thought about downsizing?" he asked casually. I looked at him. Not really. He nodded slowly. A place that size can be a lot for one person. Nicole immediately joined in. Especially as people get older. There are some wonderful communities now. Beautiful homes. Less maintenance. More convenience. I took a sip of water before answering. I like my house. Both of them smiled. Neither pushed the issue immediately. Instead, they shifted the conversation elsewhere. Work, weather, local events. Then 20 minutes later, the subject returned. This time Nicole mentioned property taxes. Daniel mentioned utility bills. Together, they painted a picture of a home that was somehow becoming impractical. What fascinated me was how carefully they worked. Neither directly suggested I leave. Neither openly pressured me. Yet every road seemed to lead toward the same destination. Eventually dinner ended and Nicole disappeared into the kitchen. Daniel remained at the table. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Have you updated your estate paperwork recently?" The question arrived so smoothly that someone else might have missed its significance. I did not. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Just thinking ahead. Making sure everything is organized." Organized. Another familiar word. I had heard it before. At the bank. During phone calls. During conversations that seemed innocent until they were examined more closely. Nicole returned carrying coffee and dessert. Almost immediately the discussion moved on. Yet the question remained sitting between us long after. Nobody was talking about it anymore. Later that night, after I returned home, I walked into Harold's old study. The room had changed very little since he passed away. His desk remained in the same place. His books still filled the shelves. Even now, stepping inside made me feel closer to him. I opened one of the desk drawers looking for a notepad. Instead, I found a small wooden box tucked toward the back. I had not opened it in years. Inside were old letters, photographs, and personal documents. As I sorted through them, I discovered an envelope with Harold's handwriting on the front. My name was written across it. Nothing else. I sat down slowly in his chair. The paper felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Then I opened the envelope. What I found inside would change the way I viewed everything that had happened since that dinner table conversation. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Harold had seen this situation coming long before I ever did. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter. Harold's handwriting was unmistakable. Even after 3 years, seeing those familiar lines felt like hearing his voice again. I sat alone in the quiet study and began reading. The letter was not dramatic. That was what struck me first. There were no alarming warnings or grand predictions. Instead, Harold described observations, small moments, casual conversations, tiny details that had caught his attention over the years. He wrote about how frequently financial topics seemed to arise whenever certain family members visited. He mentioned how gratitude often faded shortly after help had been given. Most importantly, he described a concern that had grown quietly in the background. He worried that some people no longer viewed family as family. They viewed family as opportunity. I read those words twice, then a third time. By the time I reached the end of the letter, my chest felt heavy. One sentence remained fixed in my mind. If there ever comes a day when you feel valued only for what you own, speak with Arthur Bennett. The next morning, I called the number written at the bottom of the page. Arthur answered. Personally, his voice was calm and professional. When I mentioned Harold's letter, he became quiet for a moment. I was wondering when you might call, he said. That response immediately caught my attention. We arranged to meet later that afternoon at his office downtown. The building stood near the courthouse, a place Harold had visited many times during his business career. Arthur greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. A thick folder rested on the table between us. Before we begin, he said, there is something you need to understand. Harold never stopped believing in your family. He simply believed in preparation. I nodded. That sounded exactly like my husband. Arthur opened the folder and carefully organized several documents in front of him. Most appeared to be estate records and legal updates. Then he slid one document toward me. Several years before he passed away, Harold made revisions to certain aspects of his estate planning. I looked down at the pages. The legal language was complex, but one thing became clear almost immediately. Harold had created protections, not because he expected conflict, because he understood that circumstances change when money enters the conversation. Arthur explained everything patiently. Certain assets remained under my complete control. Additional provisions existed that could affect future inheritance decisions depending on conduct and behavior. Nothing had been hidden from the law. Everything had been prepared carefully and properly. Why did he do this? I asked quietly. Arthur leaned back in his chair. Because he loved you. And because he noticed things. Those words stayed with me. He noticed things. Suddenly, I remembered dozens of conversations Harold and I had shared over the years. Times when he would quietly observe people while saying very little. Times when he seemed to understand situations long before anyone else. Arthur closed the folder. I am not suggesting you make any decisions today, he said. In fact, I recommend the opposite. I looked at him. What should I do? He gave a small smile. Watch. Listen. Say very little. People often reveal their intentions when they believe. They have already won. Driving home later that evening, I thought about everything I had learned. The dinner, the missing folder, the conversations about my house, the questions about my finances. For weeks I had been trying to determine whether I was imagining a problem. Now that uncertainty was gone, something was happening. The only thing I did not know yet was how far Daniel and Nicole were willing to go. And for the first time, I was prepared to find out. For the next 2 weeks, I followed Arthur's advice exactly. I did not confront anyone. I did not ask questions. Most importantly, I stopped offering information. The change was surprisingly easy. For years, I had been the one keeping everyone updated. I shared details about appointments, finances, repairs around the house, and future plans. Without realizing it, I had made it very easy for other people to know everything about my life. Now I simply listened. The results were immediate. Daniel began calling more often. At first, the conversations seemed harmless. He asked how I was feeling, whether I needed help with anything, whether the house was giving me trouble. I answered politely but briefly. The less information I volunteered, the more questions he seemed to have. Nicole's behavior changed as well. She suddenly became interested in spending time together. She invited me to lunch twice in the same week. During both outings, the conversation eventually drifted toward practical matters. Home maintenance, property values, retirement planning. She spoke casually, but I noticed a pattern. Every topic somehow connected back to what I owned. One afternoon, she mentioned that several houses in my neighborhood had recently sold for impressive prices. Another day, she brought up a senior living community that had opened nearby. The residents love it, she said while stirring her iced tea. Everything is taken care of for them. I smiled politely and changed the subject. Her disappointment was almost invisible. Almost. Meanwhile, I started paying closer attention to details. The next time I visited Daniel's house, I noticed several real estate brochures sitting on the kitchen counter. Nicole quickly moved them. When she saw me looking, later that afternoon, I overheard part of a conversation between them in the backyard. They lowered their voices when I approached. That alone told me enough. People only hide conversations when they fear someone might understand them. A few days later, Daniel stopped by my house unexpectedly. He carried a toolbox and insisted on checking a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen. The repair took less than 5 minutes. Yet he stayed nearly 2 hours. During that time, he asked about insurance policies, property taxes, and whether I had updated my will recently. The questions arrived casually, one after another. I answered very little. Eventually, he became frustrated without realizing it. "You seem different lately," he said. I looked at him. "Different how?" He hesitated. "More private." The irony almost made me laugh. For years I had respected their privacy without question. Now that I was protecting my own, it suddenly seemed unusual. After he left, I sat alone in the living room and thought about everything that had happened since the dinner. Arthur had been right. People reveal themselves when they believe the outcome is already decided. Daniel and Nicole seemed increasingly confident. They acted like they were moving toward a goal neither of them wanted to describe directly. Yet the closer they moved toward it, the more obvious it became. That evening, I opened Harold's letter again. One sentence stood out more than ever. "Do not judge people by what they say when things are uncertain. Watch what they do when they think the future belongs to them." I read those words several times. Then I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Because for the first time, I began to suspect that Daniel and Nicole were no longer hiding their intentions very well. And if I remained patient, they would eventually show me exactly what they wanted. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. It began with a phone call from Daniel on a Friday afternoon. His voice carried a confidence I had not heard before. "Nicole and I would like to come by this weekend," he said. "There are a few important things we want to discuss." I agreed without hesitation. By then, I was no longer afraid of the conversation. In fact, I had been waiting for it. Saturday arrived bright and warm. Daniel and Nicole showed up precisely at 1 o'clock. Nicole carried a bakery box filled with pastries. Daniel brought coffee. They looked relaxed, comfortable, almost cheerful. We sat around my kitchen table, and for the first 20 minutes they talked about ordinary things. Local news, neighborhood events, a vacation one of their friends had taken. Then Nicole placed her coffee cup down and exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. The look lasted less than a second. It was enough. I knew exactly what was coming. "Evelyn," she began gently, "we have been thinking about your future." There was that word again. Future. I smiled politely and waited. Daniel leaned forward. "We worry about you being here alone." "I appreciate the concern," I replied. Nicole nodded. "We just think there may be better options." Better options? Another familiar phrase. She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. My eyes drifted toward it, but I did not reach for it. "What kind of options?" I asked. Daniel opened the folder and removed several pages. "We have done a lot of research. There are some excellent communities nearby, places where everything is taken care of. Maintenance, security, activities." I listened quietly. Nicole immediately added more details. She described social programs, transportation services, and comfortable housing. The presentation was polished, almost rehearsed. Then came the real purpose. "If you sold this house," Nicole said carefully, "you could simplify your life tremendously." There it was. The destination every conversation had been moving toward. The house. Daniel slid one of the pages toward me. It contained information about property values and recent neighborhood sales. "The market is strong right now," he said. "This could be the perfect time." I looked down at the paper, then back at my son. "And after I sell?" A brief silence followed. Nicole answered first. "You could move somewhere more manageable." More manageable. Such a pleasant way to describe leaving the home where Harold and I had spent decades building a life together. I remained calm. Arthur's advice echoed in my mind. "Watch. Listen. Say very little." Daniel continued speaking. The more he talked, the clearer everything became. This was no longer about concern. It was about planning. They had already imagined the future. They had already decided what should happen. The only thing missing was my agreement. By the end of the conversation, Nicole seemed increasingly confident. She believed she was making progress. Daniel looked relieved, as though a difficult hurdle was finally being cleared. Neither noticed that I had offered almost no opinion. I simply listened. When they finally left, the folder remained on my kitchen table. I stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Arthur Bennett. "I think they are ready," I said quietly. There was a brief pause before he answered. "Good, because now we know exactly what they want." Arthur and I met 2 days later at his office. I brought the folder Daniel and Nicole had given me, along with every note I had made during the previous few weeks. Arthur reviewed everything carefully. He read each page, occasionally making small notes in the margin. When he finally finished, he removed his glasses and looked at me across the desk. "They are moving faster now," he said. I nodded. "I noticed." Arthur leaned back in his chair. That is often what happens. Once people believe they are close to achieving something, they become less cautious. He opened another section of Harold's file and placed several documents on the table. Most of them were updates to the estate plan. I had seen some of them before. One document was different. Arthur tapped it lightly with his finger. This is the provision Harold wanted me to discuss only if certain circumstances developed. I looked down at the page. The legal language was detailed, but the purpose became clear as Arthur explained it. Harold had created safeguards designed to protect me from pressure, manipulation, or attempts to influence major financial decisions for personal gain. Nothing about it was emotional. Nothing about it was punitive. It was simply practical. The kind of thing Harold would do. Arthur watched my reaction carefully. Your husband understood that character reveals itself over time. I thought about those words during the drive home. Character reveals itself over time. The statement felt less like legal advice and more like a summary of everything that had happened since that dinner. Over the next several days, Daniel and Nicole continued reaching out. Their calls became more frequent. Their concern became more visible. Yet the pattern remained unchanged. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subjects. The house, the future, planning, simplifying. One evening, Nicole called just before dinner. We were thinking about organizing a family meeting, she said. Nothing serious. Just everyone getting together to discuss long-term plans. I almost smiled. The invitation sounded innocent. The timing did not. Who would be there? I asked. Just family, she replied quickly. Daniel, me, and a few close relatives. I told her I would think about it. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room and watched the sun fade beyond the backyard trees. Something about the invitation felt significant. Not because of what Nicole said, because of what she did not say. The following morning, I met my granddaughter Emma for coffee. Unlike Daniel and Nicole, she never asked about my finances. She never mentioned the house. She simply wanted to spend time together. We talked about her job, her friends, and the trip she hoped to take later that year. Halfway through our conversation, she looked at me carefully. Grandma, are you okay? She asked. I smiled gently. Why would you ask that? Because something feels different lately. I considered her words for a moment. Then I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Sometimes people learn things they should have understood years ago. She did not fully understand what I meant, but she smiled anyway. After we said goodbye, I drove home feeling strangely peaceful. For the first time since that dinner, I was no longer confused. I knew exactly what Daniel and Nicole wanted. More importantly, I knew something they did not. Harold had anticipated this possibility years ago. And while they were busy preparing their family meeting, Arthur and I were preparing for something else entirely. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday afternoon at Daniel and Nicole's house. When I arrived, several relatives were already there. Emma sat near the living room window. A few cousins occupied the sofa. Everyone seemed curious about why this gathering had been organized so suddenly. Daniel greeted me at the door with unusual enthusiasm. Nicole offered a warm smile and guided me toward the largest chair in the room. The entire scene felt carefully arranged, almost theatrical. I took my seat and quietly observed. A tray of snacks sat untouched on the coffee table. Nervous energy filled the room. After everyone settled in, Daniel stood and cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming, he said. We wanted to discuss some important family matters. Several relatives exchanged glances. Nicole nodded encouragingly beside him. Daniel began talking about responsibility, planning, and preparing for the future. His words sounded thoughtful on the surface. He spoke about making sure everyone was protected. He spoke about reducing burdens and simplifying decisions. More than once, he mentioned my well-being. Each sentence was polished, practiced. Then Nicole joined the conversation. She described how difficult it could become for older people to maintain large homes. She discussed financial efficiency. She talked about avoiding unnecessary complications. Listening to her, I almost admired the presentation. Almost. Because every road led toward the same destination. My house. My finances. My independence. Eventually, Daniel produced a folder. The same folder I had already reviewed with Arthur. He placed it on the coffee table and looked directly at me. Mom, we believe this plan would be best for everyone. There was that phrase again. Best for everyone. I noticed several relatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Emma looked confused. She clearly had not been told the full purpose of the meeting beforehand. Daniel opened the folder and began explaining the proposal. The more he spoke, the clearer everything became. The house would eventually be sold. Certain financial decisions would move under shared management. Future arrangements would be handled collectively. Collectively. Another pleasant word that concealed an uncomfortable reality. When he finally finished, silence settled over the room. Everyone looked toward me, waiting. Nicole smiled patiently. She seemed confident, certain, as though the outcome had already been decided. I folded my hands in my lap and took a slow breath. You have obviously spent a great deal of time thinking about this, I said calmly. Relief flashed across Daniel's face. Nicole smiled even wider. They mistook my composure for agreement. Then the front doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house. Daniel frowned slightly. Are you expecting someone? Nicole asked. I looked toward the entryway. Actually, yes. A few moments later, Arthur Bennett stepped into the living room carrying a leather briefcase. The atmosphere changed immediately. Confusion replaced confidence. Daniel stared at him. Nicole's smile disappeared. Arthur greeted everyone politely before taking an empty chair near mine. He placed the briefcase on his lap and looked around the room. Nobody spoke. The silence felt different now. Heavier. More uncertain. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. What exactly is going on? He asked. Arthur glanced at me briefly before answering. That is a very good question. I met Daniel's eyes for the first time that afternoon. For weeks I had listened, observed, waited. Now, for the first time, I realized something important. The meeting Daniel and Nicole believed they had planned for me was about to become something entirely different.